This, ladies and gentlemen, is a video dedicated to my members on Patreon. Thank you guys for supporting KaspaChess and for not giving up on this channel. In today's video, I'm going to show you a complete opening repertoire to use against the French defense. That's e4, e6. And here are some of the lines that we're going to look at in this study. After e4, e6, you will always play pawn to d4. And the moment black plays d5, which is the French defense, you are simply going to advance, waiting for them to go pawn to c5, which they do, by the way. And now you would want to play pawn to c3, connecting your pawns as shown on the board. But here is a little adjustment. You will first of all play pawn to a3. This will be your third move, allowing black to take on d4, and you will see the reason why we want them to take. Sometimes you will see the move knight c6, and now that you know they are not interested to take just yet, this is when you play pawn to c3. And say after queen b6, now you're going to be playing knight f3. So the first thing to remember is developing these four pawns first. Once you play like this, you will eliminate a lot of blunders and opening mistakes that you make in the French defense. You will also avoid some unnecessary traps that you may not even be aware of. So in short, we have two plans. After pawn to c5, it's either you continue with the traditional advanced variation of the French defense, where you play pawn to c3 immediately, or you forget about pawn to c3 if black takes on d4 and rather go bishop d3 first, followed by pawn to f4. These are the two plans I'm going to recommend in this opening repertoire. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is very much playable even in real OTB tournaments. So stay tuned and don't blink. So first of all, let's begin with our sacrificial line where we don't play pawn to c3 in the opening stage. So you start with e4, and after pawn to e6, you go pawn to d4 as usual. d5, you first of all go e5, and after pawn to c5, this is where you change your strategy and switch to a weird plan that will be unfamiliar to your opponents, beginning with the move pawn to a3. As you can see, this has also been played at the top level. You can check for yourselves in the Masters database. No one has ever lost. My God. Anyway, after CD, you don't ever want to take back. We want to use this pawn as a shield. In other words, think of this as black's biggest liability. This is our defender, so we'll just leave it like that. Think of this as a weird gambit. In this type of French defense, you only have to worry about one move, which you can easily defend, by the way, pawn to f6. And so to stop this, you want to rush out with a move bishop d3, because if pawn to f6, you will go queen h5 check. So black will play something like knight c6, attacking your e5 pawn. And now you can safely play pawn to f4, holding on to your central pawn. See what happens if you make any other careless move like knight f3. You see, since your queen can't go to h5 now, black may play pawn to f6. This is what I was talking about, and it kind of disturbs our plan. You are forced to take, and then black takes back with a knight. They are doing fine. And that's why you don't just want to rush out with a move knight f3. Forget about this for the time being. Which is why you always want to go pawn to f4, leaving an option of going queen h5 check, supported by your light squad bishop. Another point, now you see the importance of playing pawn to a3 back on move 4. Yep, it is to stop knight b4 or bishop b4 check. Let's see what most lichess players play in this position. You can see for yourselves, knight ge7 is what everybody plays. Sometimes they play bishop c5, and sometimes they just go ahead and blunder with f6, forgetting you have queen h5 check. Anyway, knight ge7 is the top played move, and now this is when you can go knight f3. Again, you can see in the Masters database, no losses for white at this point. Anyway, this time f6 doesn't really make sense. Like here, you can just take, and after gh, you have knight h4, and black has some issues to do with g6. For example, if bishop g7, you can easily go queen h5, make them lose their right to castle, like this, and now you continue playing your chess. In this line, at least you don't have to worry about queen b6 check and all that stuff, because black is blocking himself. Not to mention that you are one move away from capturing on h7 if pawn to f5, these are just weaknesses. You can go back to f3 if you want and re-strategize. You also have pawn to g4, pawn break in some lines. Who are you? Anyway, you won't see most of your opponents playing f6 though. I was just trying to make a point. The move you will most likely see is knight f5 in this position. But what I used to do in the past was just to take. Taking is okay, but knight bd2 is best, because you want to put your queen's knight on b3 someday, or probably just relocate it to the king side as highlighted. If you're looking at knight e3, by the way, that's a 1-0 move. You have queen e2, and you're just one move away from getting back your pawn anyways. You don't even need to get it back. It's your best defender. Bishop c5 is what I see in the Lichess database, but now you justify your point of developing your queen's knight to d2 first after bishop b6. Here you can even play pawn to c3 so that you take on d4 with tempo. There is no pawn takes, by the way, due to bishop takes e3. Come on, that's just a free piece. So you have all these tactics, you guys, all because of that little distraction you set on d4. Once again, start with the advanced variation. And the moment black plays c5, you change your mind. You don't play pawn to c3 like what everybody does. You go pawn to a3. I read a book somewhere which was discussing this move in detail, especially when you are playing against the French. Sometimes you can start in the traditional way, put your pawns as highlighted, and then your fourth move can be pawn to a3 before you continue doing whatever you want to do. This pawn is a magical pawn. Anyway, so pawn to a3 once again. After cd, you don't take back. You go bishop d3. Again, if you go pawn to f4 right away, maybe black may play pawn to f6 and you won't be in time to give a check on h5 due to g6. That's why before playing pawn to f4, you always want to start with bishop d3 so that f6 can be met with queen h5 check. Again, there's nothing much that you can see. Knight c6, attacking the e5 pawn is what everybody plays. Then you go pawn to f4. We saw what happens after knight e7. You know they intend to put their knight on f5 someday, after which you can go knight bd2. In fact, there's a line in this position after knight f5 and knight bd2. If black doesn't play knight e3 where you do this, and say they just continue normally with the move bishop e7. Once again, the idea of developing your knight on d2 is to put it on b3 someday so that you can take like this. Again, there's no need to rush, taking on f5. That's good, but it's not the best option in this world. Once again, knight e3. You don't have to be desperate, giving up your bishop pair. Just go queen e2, stopping knight takes g2. And maybe this time black may play queen b6, the move they like playing in the French defense. But you see, since you can't play pawn to c3, this time in order to win a free knight, due to queen takes, you can even take on d4 like this. Pop. Now the knight is under attack. Say after knight takes, you just take, you oversimplify the game, and after queen takes, you go queen takes e3 if you want to go straight into the end game against your higher rated opponent, or play bishop takes e3 if you are ready to fight. The point is, if queen takes b2 happens, now you castle short, or first make black lose his right to castle. This is also an interesting line where they do this, and then you take. After pap, you castle short or play king f2 or better king d2 because black doesn't have bishop b4 check due to your wonderful pawn on a3. And in this position, it is black who is supposed to be very careful. For example, if they just play moves like rook c8, first you can play queen d3 defending this and also targeting the h7 pawn. And maybe if something like rook c6, which looks normal because they want to double up their rooks, create a little battery. Now you can go rook hb1 and there is real trouble, you guys. In fact, the queen is trapped. There's nothing that black can do in this position unless they want to lose some more material. Now, after allowing black to take on d4 and then you play bishop d3, then knight c6 and pawn to f4. It's not every time you are going to see your opponents playing knight e7 with an intention to put it on f5. Sometimes you might see the move bishop c5 or bishop e7, it doesn't even matter. But once again, your job is very simple. Just to go knight f3, knight bd2 as you saw before, then put your queen's knight on b3, you castle short, blah blah blah. But see, in this particular line, because black's dark squared bishop is no longer guarding the g7 pawn, it makes sense for us to go queen g4. This is just another tactical move that you can try instead of knight f3 and knight bd2 then knight b3. Queen g4 actually forces black to play pawn to g6, creating some dark square weaknesses. And after this, you can safely play whatever you want. Knight f3, just continuing with your main plan. By the way, don't ever worry about this d4 pawn. It's your defender, it's your best defender, and you can easily capture it somewhere in the middle game. So here you can even play pawn to b4. After bishop b6, you have bishop b2 in the long run. You can also play knight f3 in this position. If you're looking at pawn to h5, that's a 1-0 move because you have queen g3. See, you will castle short very well and all that. In chess, it's not just all about how many pieces you have. It's about how many active pieces you have. Say knight g7, maybe. Here you can even castle short. If they do the same, you go knight h4. Maybe one day you will sack on g6. If king h7, you play king h1. Say knight f5. Here I think the knight is more active than my light squared bishop. So I'll take on f5 with my bishop so that after ef, I go knight d2. At least black doesn't have this discovery check. My king is on h1. And what I want to do is to put my queen's knight on g5 someday, God willing. Say bishop e6. I can even play bishop b2. No weaknesses. Rook c8, knight df3, a5, knight g5 check. This is the point. Say king g7, knight takes e6 check, and after fe, I have queen takes g6 check, and it's just a matter of time before I checkmate my opponent. I mean, you're going to see these things happening in your games. Here you can play queen h6 check, for example, and after this, you take on e6 with tempo. If rook f7, you take on f5. I mean, it's just total disaster. Let's say this. First, you have queen g6 check. If king h8, you have rook f3. And after this, you have queen f6 check, king g8, then rook g3 check. It's just a matter of time. Again, you may think of this in terms of an obstruction or an interference tactic where you impose an enemy piece in order to close some critical lines for them. Now, you see, after bishop d3, if black rushes out with the move knight g7, intending to go knight f5 next, once again you can just continue with your normal piece development, pawn to f4 since your last squared bishop is already on d3. And after knight f5, again you don't really have to take because you're just going to open up some lines for your opponent. You can play knight f3 once again. If knight e2, you know what to do. You play queen e2. You don't just get rid of your bishop pair just yet. If bishop e7 this time, since there's nothing to attack on c5, well, you can just castle short. And after castle short, look at this threat. These are moments where you want to get rid of your opponent's most active piece. This is okay. And after pawn takes, you take back on d4. That's if you want. With your knight, and if bishop c5, pinning your knight, or you can even go pawn to b4. That's the purpose of playing a3. If bishop takes, you take back with your queen, and if queen b6, by the way, you can just mess up your opponent's pawn structure and continue playing a normal game of chess. Bishop e3 looks great. It attacks the pawn. You're about to develop your other rook, and this is not the French defense that you see every day. Now let's look at one last line where black may be forced to destroy your strategy on the queen side. For example, after bishop d3, say black plays this unnatural move a6 with an idea of, playing b4 in the near future. Well, seeing this, you can rush out with knight d2 if you think about it. After pawn to b5, you go knight b3, because if b4 comes, you don't even have to take. You can just take on d4 if you want, or leave that as your defender and rather go knight f3. If pawn takes, you take back with your a pawn. Still, black can't play bishop b4 check or knight b4 in the near future. If queen b6 for some reason, you can just castle short. At any given point in time, you will be able to take that pawn, maybe somewhere in the middle game after you put your king on h1. See that this time we didn't play pawn to f4 but knight f3. This is also fine. I just wanted to show you that anything is playable. After b4, we played knight f3. Pawn to f4 is also playable. Nothing wrong with this, by the way. If ba, you take back. I just don't want you guys to, to be memorizing stuff. You go knight f3, knight c6, you castle short. And always remember, after castling short, it is always safe to put your king on h1 in most of these lines. If knight f5, you can even take up. If you want, you can take to oversimplify things. I mean, this is just how easy you can play against the French. Look at this move. Instead of taking, you even pin the knight, bishop c5, you go bishop takes. If bishop takes, you go knight takes. After castle short, look who has some weaknesses to worry about. I can play queen d3 in this position and continue with my normal development. Now, speaking of our second game plan, after black plays knight c6, can we somehow continue with our first plan of going pawn to f4 and bishop d3? The answer is no. Note that our first game plan only works perfectly if black takes on d4. That's when you want to play moves like f4, first protecting your e5 pawn, and then bishop d3. There's a reason why. But if black chooses not to take immediately by playing moves like knight c6, queen b6, you just turn this back to the normal French defense and follow everything that I'm about to show you in the following chapter. Right, pawn to a3 comes later in the game anyways to prevent bishop b4 or knight b4. If queen b6 is played, you go knight to f3, supporting your d4 pawn. Your light squared bishop should not sit in the way of your queen and your d4 pawn. It will sit on e2, so don't worry about that. Let's say bishop d7, that's what they play. And how you go pawn to b4. Why? Because you just want to force black to take your d pawn so that you can take back with your c pawn. See what I was talking about? You still have those two powerful center pawns. And by the way, black has no attack. If they play something like a5, just a move to challenge your d pawn, advance that pawn, and this is all possible because of your well advanced two pawns. Knight a7, pawn to a4, deal done. If bishop b4 check, you also have bishop d2 to challenge that. If they take, you take back with your b knight. What else? Queen c7, rook c1. These are all possibilities, and you develop your light squared bishop. This time you can even develop it on d3 since your d4 pawn is no longer under pressure, and you will castle short. Now, speaking of the normal advanced variation of the French defense, after c5, pawn to c3, knight c6, and the normal move knight to f3 instead of pawn to f3 immediately, there are times you're going to see your opponents trying to mess up your center pawns as soon as possible with the move pawn to f6, and you're going to see when they play that. First of all, they go queen b6 as usual. Then see what I was talking about. Pawn to a3 always comes sooner or later. In the French defense, queen b6 goes together with pawn to a3. Why? Because the real pressure is not on d4. The real pressure is on b4. If you count how many pieces are targeting this square, and this is the first time you are hearing this probably, the pawn is controlling this square, the queen is eyeballing this square, the knight is eyeballing this square, and also the dark squared bishop. So 4 pieces are looking at the b4 square. So once you see queen b6, it's high time you go pawn to a3, preparing for pawn to b4 next to force this exchange. So that's the way to go, you guys. And whenever a5 comes, you know what to do. You just advance your b pawn and play pawn to f4 next. Simple. If they take, you take, just to simplify. That's all good. You still have your two center pawns, and it is in such positions where most black players like playing pawn to f6. For what? They just want to mess up your center pawns, trying to fight back on the center. And by the way, your light squared bishop will be sitting on e2 most of the times, so that you don't block the vision of your queen on your d pawn. So after pawn to f6, the best you can do is just to ignore that. So in this particular position, if you look at your pawn chain, the best you can do is not to take, because you're going to remain with an isolated d pawn and your center won't be as strong as before. Better let them take your e pawn so that you can replace that with your d pawn, and see, you're still controlling these highlighted squares in the absence of your d pawn, and black can't play bishop b4 check. So just think of advancing your two center pawns. You will play the rest of your middle game based on these pawns or the e pawn. They play knight trying to come here, or play knight g6 because that's what they do. And in this particular position, black is more likely going to play knight g6, teaming up with this other knight so that they can take your e5 pawn. So in this particular position, since you don't have a pawn on d4, you can play bishop d3 if you want. If knight g6 comes, I wouldn't mind taking that knight, honestly. And there's even a funny trap that can happen here, beginning with bishop e3, deliberately leaving your pawn on b2 hanging so that you can now go knight a4, which almost traps your enemy's queen. Maybe something like bishop b4 check may help, but you don't even have to take, allowing black to take back with his queen. Just go king f1 and the queen is completely dead. Word of advice, once you start studying the Alpine variation, you also need to be studying the French defense with white pieces, because many other times you are going to see the game transposing back into the French defense after this line. So you need to know a bit of the French as well. So that makes your work easier. You stop studying how to play against the Sicilian defense, but you just begin studying how to play against the French defense. They play knight c6, and this is where you want to play pawn to a3 or knight to f3 first, so that if queen b6 comes, now you go pawn to a3. A very important move in the opening stage of the French defense. cd, bishop d7, and now you go knight c3. If knight g7, you know what they want to do, right? So you go knight a4, chasing that queen away. Sometimes before black plays knight ge7, what they like doing is playing pawn to a6, so that even if knight a4 comes, they can put their queen on a7. But in this case, you can still go knight a4. It's not much of a stretch. Or even pawn to b4. If queen a7, now you go pawn to b4. Move order still the same. Knight ge7 is going to come. They want to put their knight here and put more pressure on this pawn. But thanks to your b4 move, you can now put your bishop here. Or if you don't have bishop b2, this is where you develop your dark squared bishop on e3. So bishop b2 seals the deal. If knight a5, well, that's too late, because now you can put your knight on c5 if you want. If they take, here you can even take with your d pawn. You still have your e center pawn intact and 3 connected pawns on the queen side, so that's okay. If pawn to b6 is played, chasing this knight, instead of taking the bishop, you know what? You can as well just take this pawn. It's free. If anything, you're going to support that knight with pawn to b5, followed by pawn to a4. Done. Speaking of this knight maneuver in the French defense, which puts more pressure on the d4 pawn, what black players like playing first is the move bishop d7 to stop this attack in the near future. And so one key opening move in the French defense is pawn to a3 as usual, stopping bishop b4 or knight b4. And this is when they play knight ge7 with the same idea of attacking your d4 pawn 3 times. So seeing this idea, this time you can't play bishop d3, because after this, and queen takes, you don't have bishop b5 check because of this light squared bishop. That's why they play bishop d7, by the way. So the best you can do in the French defense when there's already a bishop on d7 is not playing bishop d3, but knight a4 to chase this queen away, so that even if knight f5 comes, there will only be 2 attackers versus 2 defenders. Queen a5 check doesn't count because of b4, and the queen must go back. That's how you defend your d4 pawn in the French defense. Now, before I end this video, allow me to show you at least one example game that was played between 2 master level players. So white played e4, then black played e6, and after d4, d5 was played, e5, the advanced variation, and then immediately black played pawn to c5, white decided to play a3. This game that we're looking at was played between Dutina Dario and Medic Marjana in 2005. Pardon my pronunciation. After a3, black took, and then white played bishop d3. This was played over the board, by the way. Knight c6. White continued with pawn to f4, following our first game plan. And then knight ge7 was played. Then white played knight f3, because what else? At this point, the game is dead equal. Both parties are just developing their minor pieces, which is what you're supposed to be doing in the opening stage. Black played knight g6. And then white castled short. And then bishop e7, because what else? b4 was played. To avoid b5, black played a6. And then white played something that I haven't covered so far, just to show you that almost anything can work as long as you're doing the right thing with this system. g3, maybe not allowing black to play knight h4, but I don't really understand the logic. And then black played queen c7, then bishop b2, maybe wanting to get back the d pawn. No blunders yet. Bishop d7, knight bd2, a developing move, maybe intending to go knight b3 next as I advised, and black just castled short here, and then knight b3. Black played f5, the move that I talked about, and then white played knight b takes d4. After knight takes, f5 was played, trying to oversimplify the game, maybe like this, but white decided to play c3 so that if pawn takes, maybe he could take back with a c pawn. Queen b6, pinning the knight to the king, but white played rook f2. Queen e2 was also playable, rook f7. It seems up to this point, there's nothing much that is happening to start the attack, but here is where it all started going crazy after pawn to g4. A committal move. If f takes g4, I guess white just wanted to take back with the queen, but in the game, black played knight h4, a logical move. Then gf happened and ef, and then immediately white played queen e2. So white was slowly building up for a devastating attack, not to rush, but still with a comfortable position. Bishop e6 was played, and then knight takes e6, queen takes c4. If pawn takes, white intended to take back and win some material, so ab was played instead, and then ab anyways. Game simplified on the queen side. Then bishop takes pawn, which was some kind of a mistake because this allowed white to connect his central pawns. Here I don't know what happened after queen takes d5. It's like black resigned or something like that after seeing white had bishop c4, and I guess it was just going to be a matter of time before winning this game, slowly but sure. And this is one example that shows you how practical games can go. The whole point is at least you're not going to miss any tactical shots or run into any unknown French traps. The second game that I would quickly want to show is one that was played between Richman Egon and Tits Hamo in 2000, where white played c3, and after knight c6, a3 was played. After queen b6, white played knight f3 and bishop d7. And then look at this. Because of this beautiful pawn chain on the queen side, white found an opportunity to go pawn to b4. This is what I'm talking about, ladies and gentlemen. And the point was, whatever black does, white was still going to remain with a fixed pawn structure with no any weaknesses. a5 was played, but then white played pawn to b5, knight a7, attacking this pawn, then knight c3. Well, the point was, if knight takes b5 or bishop takes b5, whatever, say knight takes b5, white was simply going to be up a piece after bishop takes, because if bishop takes by black, there was going to be rook b1, pinning the knight to the queen, which is why in the game, black didn't take on b5. I mean, after white played knight c3. Instead, queen c7 was played, attacking the knight, and then white played bishop b2, then b6, and then rook c1, maybe trying to do a little discovery, queen b7, bishop d3, just a normal developing move, intending to castle short, knight e7. Again, what did I say? Whenever you see knight e7, just know black wants to play knight f5 next. This is why white started pawn storming right away on the king side. One of the strategies that you can employ. I guess the idea was after knight f5, he was going to play pawn to g4, which is one of the lines that you can play, by the way. And if knight h6, you simply go knight g5. Then later, you consider playing queen f3. I mean, after castling short or whatever you want to do. In the game, after h4, black played h5. And then knight g5 was played anyways, maybe intending to go queen f3 next. Knight f5 was played by black. And then queen f3. This looked like white just hung the pawn on d4, but the whole idea was if knight takes happened, white was going to take on f7 with the queen check, and then after king d8, simply go knight e2, double attacking this knight, and black was going to lose. Say knight f5, because what else? I guess knight takes e6 check was what white had prepared, because if bishop takes only move, that was going to be queen takes b7. I guess this is the reason why black did not take on d4 after white played queen f3. So clearly we see this pawn was not hanging. Instead, black played pawn to g6, and then the game continued as follows. Bishop takes f5, pawn takes, then a4, holding on to the b5 pawn, rook c8, and then castle short. And as you can see from the eval bar, it was very clear that white was winning. If Magnus was playing as white in this position, he was definitely going to win against any chess player. But white, being a 2291 rated opponent, failed to convert. After rook c4 was played, he missed this tactical shot knight takes d5, which was winning instantly. Instead, he played rook fd1, which kind of threw some of the advantage away, but he was still winning though. I don't know why this game ended in a draw. You see, the whole point was, had he seen this move knight takes d5, he was probably going to win this game easily. Because after all, black couldn't do anything. Say rook takes, there was going to be knight f6 check, discovery on the queen, and just a matter of time before checkmating black. And say if black played something like ed, still white had this move rook takes, being up an exchange with a plus 5.9 advantage. See that black can't take due to queen takes b7. If black took on d5 with the queen, there was still going to be rook takes c4. Again, white was going to be up an exchange. Don't look at queen takes c4 taking the rook, because there was queen a8 check and white was going to win a free piece, the knight. If knight c8, there was going to be a rook c1, I guess. And then look at this. So this is how white was supposed to continue this. I was only interested in the opening stage. I guess you learned a lot of things from these games, and that's how you play against the French defense, ladies and gentlemen. I hope this helped a lot and can't wait to hear from your feedback. As you know, this piece is only dedicated to you, my serious patrons, and it's not to be shared on internet. Once again, thank you so much for your support, and continue supporting this page and our YouTube channel, because that's the only way you encourage us to keep on making more wonderful videos just like this one.